So yeah, good afternoon. Very nice to see all of you here. And I am going to introduce myself, which sounds a little weird, but we're having a bit of technical difficulties. So, so I'm actually not really going to do too much of an introduction. I am Andrea Hurst. I am the ISCIA or chair, which is the chair of identities and social cohesion in Africa at Nelson Mandela University. And I am one of the co-hosts of this seminar series on thinking about thinking. And I am going to present a topic today called "Are we willing to think?" It's quite associated, I suppose, with the obviously with the seminar brief, and it is something that we will. You'll see we'll be drawing a bit from some of the previous seminars. So in a way, it's a sort of a kind of catch our breath. Let's sum up. Let's have a little bit of a look at what we've done already and start thinking about how we're going to move forward. So that's roughly what I'm planning to do in the seminar. But I think the best thing to do would be to actually just start it. So let me get the PowerPoint up. There we go. Hope everyone can see that. Yeah, so question, are we willing to think? In his epilogue to Otherlands, Thomas Halliday sums up his understanding of our situation. I'll just read it to you quickly. Unlike past occasions when a single species or group of species has fundamentally altered the biosphere, the oxygenation of the oceans, the laying down of the coal swamps, our species is in an unusual position of control over the outcome. We know that change is occurring. We know that we are responsible. We know what will happen if it continues. We know that we can stop it, and we know how. And the question is whether we will try. Well, yeah, so far our efforts to prevent environmental catastrophe are at best, half-hearted, lacking in resolve. We mostly just continue with environmentally destructive activities. The damage keeps escalating, and the risk that we and many other living organisms will be wiped out keeps increasing. I mean, nature, of course, will carrying on long after humans disappear. But we are acting in a way that's self-defeating. And that self-defeating behavior is perplexing. Socrates would have attributed it to simple ignorance, because for him it was unthinkable to behave in a way that contradicts your knowledge. Halliday clearly disagrees, and I'm with him on this. Even if we accept that we cannot ever know complex environmental and social systems well enough to be completely sure that we can make precisely the right choices about what actions to take, we nevertheless possess good enough information to act far more wisely than we currently do. So in this seminar, we're looking at attributing our self-defeating behavior to problematic thinking. And in broader terms, a problematic philosophical vision. I mean, a philosophical vision encompasses the way we portray thinking and our understanding of the world, of how knowledge works, of values, of relationships with one another and the material world, and the meaning of art. So we're assuming that all of this is connected and that changes in ways of thinking motivate changes in ways of being. And we're asking, well, what has been so problematic in our dominant way of thinking that we now face environmental and social catastrophe? This question comes from Deleuze's articulation and critique of the dogmatic image of thought, indifference, and repetition. So it's not surprising that we've heard quite a bit from or about Deleuze in more than one of our presentations, our previous ones. But because we inevitably have to kind of scramble far too fast through the details, I'm hoping for a kind of repeating differently over the year that will kind of help us gain deeper insight into this problematic. So I want to walk through the dogmatic image of thought again, because it's really crucial to understand the loaded question of my title. Are we willing to think? And with apologies in advance then for I'm just going to touch on the will, but it is a seminar about thinking. So the dogmatic image of thought refers to what Deleuze thinks we take for granted when we imagine what thinking is all about. If you ask Google the question, what is thinking? You'll get the picture. Deleuze kind of sums it all up as 8 postulates, and we'll just have a look at them one by one quick. First, we take it for granted that thinking is good because we think to get at the truth, and of course the truth is good, and truth is understood here as that rock solid or stable, coherent state of affairs that lies behind a confusing or contradictory surface. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. The second postulate is a bit more complex. We assume that proper thinking is done by this central unified subject, I, who perceives and thinks about a stable, knowable, recognizable reality, which is conceived as a kind of organic whole with coherent structures and meanings. And this thinking is seen as a matter of judgment, which involves the cooperation of common sense and good sense. So common sense refers to that harmonious collaboration of our faculties of sense, intellect, reason, imagination, you could add emotion, to give us a persisting, identifiable, repeatable, recognizable object. That's common sense. Good sense refers to our power to assess which faculty to use or which faculty to trust for the kind of object that we're looking at, so that our faculties do only what they're supposed to do and they don't overstep their boundaries. Third postulate, we believe we're thinking well when we think according to a model of recognition, where all of our faculties are in agreement. The same object may be seen or touched or remembered or imagined or conceived. Fourth, we believe we are thinking clearly when we can differentiate properly between distinctive things. We imagine that identifiable entities are there first, and then differences just emerge later in the comparisons between them that enable us to categorize them. Okay, fifth, we see errors as undesirable faults that undermine thinking, but they come from the outside, so brain disorders or emotional distractions, and they can be recognized and they can be fixed. Sixth, we assume that everything has a sufficient reason, and we dismiss nonsense as unproductive. We find it far worse to kind of produce nonsense than to make an honest error. Seventh, we define proper problems by the possibility of their being solved, where the problem disappears as a result of a true solution. So if you pose improper problems, ones that can't be solved, you are being stupid. Finally, learning is seen as a kind of a linear process where, having been confronted with a proper problem, you make the passage from non-knowing to knowing, which you identify as possessing the solution. Okay, so you might be looking at all of this and thinking, well, what's the issue? What's Deleuze's issue with this? I mean, if you examine what you do when you think things through, isn't this exactly what you do? And what's so wrong with it? How can it be linked to this self-defeating behavior that's leading us towards environmental disaster or our own possible extinction? I think that Deleuze's bottom line worry is that these 8 postulates of the dogmatic image of thought describe not thinking, but instrumental processing. So when we believe we are teaching or acquiring critical thinking skills, instead we are just ingraining instrumental processing. And our added worry in this seminar is that negotiating the environmental and social challenges that we face right now needs a willingness to think rather than merely process. So then the question would be, well, what does it mean to think? And this comes out in Deleuze's critique of the dogmatic image of thought. And again, he goes through this one by one. So firstly, he says thinking doesn't have a good nature. It's not an orderly activity inspired by this noble love of wisdom and the desire to find deep, simple truth behind the messy appearances. Instead, thinking is excited and kept alive by its inability to come to rest in the discovery of final truths. Secondly, our neat picture of this harmonious accord of our faculties in good judgments about objects just doesn't describe thinking. Instead, thinking is provoked by an encounter with something jarring and upsetting, often like a nasty shock, and we experience a disjunction between the faculties that leaves us in a state of discomfort and frustration and anxiety, and awed by something we just can't wrap our minds around. So if we try to process this encounter in terms of the dogmatic image of thought, we'd be asking, what is the truth here? Did I see it right, or were my emotions interfering? Did I imagine things? Was the thing I saw today the same one I remember from yesterday? Are these precisely the same kinds of things? Maybe I understood it all wrong because I was upset. Well, it can't be paradoxical. I must have made a mistake somewhere. This is the real problem. Now I've figured out what the real problem is, I can figure out the solution. And then I would have learned something, and so on. That's how it goes. And in working like this, we convert this thought-provoking, upsetting encounter to an object of recognition. Instead of opening ourselves up to a creative adventure, we frame this kind of mind-bending challenge into something understandable and manageable, something small, something within our power to shrug off in the end as no problem at all. So for Deleuze, the greatest risk for thinking is the stupidity of good sense, which kind of flattens out something ineffable by considering it only in the terms of what is already recognizable. He's not denying that acts of recognition are a large part of daily life and they have to be there. But it's when we do not recognize, when we have difficulty recognizing that we truly think. He also argues that first there is a primary multiplicity of dynamic forces of differentiation, and then we use oppositions and contradictions and analogies, those kinds of strategies of differentiation as kind of blunt, rough, second-order cognitive tools to reduce and simplify the play of differences so we can categorize and group and make entities. We can't afford, or we can't avoid doing this. We have to do it, but we do need to be aware of what we're doing when we do it and aware of the limits that it places us under. He also insists that many traditionally understood instances of falsity, especially in the realm of art, may turn out to be life-affirming and desirable. And he adds that all those traditionally subversive figures, other than those of error, figures of madness and absurdity and superstition, forgetting and stupidity and inner illusion, alienation, vulgarity, cruelty, the grotesque, the terrifying, cowardice, cruelty, baseness, all of those shouldn't be dismissed as just these privative traits which are external to thinking and which generally undermine thinking. We shouldn't be thinking along those lines, he's saying. He's saying sometimes these mad states of mind indicate deeper insights that reason is unable to access. The sixth postulate, if the point of thinking is to make sense, then that which forces us to think something that makes no sense is destroyed in the very act of thinking. But why must there be sense or meaning? Deleuze is insisting that you find thinking in nonsense as the kind of the condition for this endlessly generative creativity. So for him also, a problem acts as the disruptive kind of polemical demand for a different kind of thinking. Problems are raised because we've become perplexed again by what we thought was self-evident. So if you insist on a problem where others find none, it's a polemical gesture, a way of disrupting given ways of speaking about and understanding being. Problems become creative when they can't be solved, when the questions have no good answers, but generate more questions, as well as inconsistencies and paradoxes and ironies and circularities. They kind of challenge both common sense and good sense, and they attract other problems. And finally, he says, outcomes-based learning names a kind of a profound distortion of what learning is. I mean, for Deleuze, we never know in advance how someone will learn. I mean, learning is this involuntary adventure. It's more unconscious than intentional, and it takes us beyond what is already known or what can be done at present. Okay, so to return to the problematic of the seminar, I mean, I don't believe we can figure this environmental crisis out using these powerful but limited dominant philosophical vision of the world that we've been habituated into and using the tools of its trade. I mean, I think that this vision and these tools are part of the problem, and instead we have to start thinking. I agree with Deleuze that to think is to create, to bring into being something that didn't exist before. And to let thinking happen, we have to open ourselves to a kind of traumatic, disorienting overturning of some deeply held convictions. And we would also need radical changes in our philosophical vision and our being in the world, including a general shift in human disposition from power, fear, and competition to paradox, humor, humility. All of this is included in a willingness to think rather than merely process. And this is what we need to negotiate the environmental and social challenges we face right now. Well, no shit, Sherlock. These ideas have echoed in philosophy down the ages, and probably even more so in literature. An especially loud echo stems from Nietzsche, whose first book was published just over 150 years ago, down through Heidegger, others 100 years ago, Deleuze and Derrida 50 years ago now, can you believe it? To a host of contemporary complexity scholars, feminists, environmentalists, queer theorists, and so on. So with some qualification to accommodate complexity, I pretty much agree with Halliday that the core question regarding this impending environmental catastrophe is not whether we have the intellectual wherewithal to change, not even whether we know what it is we need to change to. The question is whether we will try. And it hasn't happened yet. Despite all of the ideas and all the lip service paid to them, including my own, including what I have just said now, about the need for thinking, what it entails, and the radical change in being it imposes. We as a species have just not let go yet of the dogmatic image of thought. We carry on teaching ourselves instrumental processing rather than thinking, and we haven't opened ourselves to the traumatic overturning of deeply held convictions and habits. We continue along with our perplexing, self-defeating behavior in the face of this environmental catastrophe. So it does suggest a different emphasis in the question, are we willing to think? But here, of course, you step into a minefield, which is going to take far longer than the time we have available to navigate. But we can make a start. So I'm just going to put down a few ideas that we could hopefully chat about later. First thing we need to do is to start thinking about the double nature of will. This concept is a kind of complex mix of agency, the freedom to act, and desire, the motivation to act. And the question of will is not just, can I do this at will, or am I free to act? It's also, do I will this? And here the question's stronger than do I want or desire this, although it incorporates it. When I want or desire something, I think I'm still a bit passive. When I will something, it must happen. So to will something is to want it strongly enough to motivate the action that will bring it into being. Thinking in terms of agency, do we have the agency or the freedom to will the transformation that enables us to think rather than merely process? Halliday's answer is affirmative, but there's also a kind of deep current of skepticism about the will, suggesting that free will is an illusion. So from an ordinary life perspective, this skepticism seems kind of obviously counterintuitive. So where does it come from? Would be something I'd like to start thinking about. Nietzsche argued that philosophy, governed by the dogmatic image of thought, produced it. Roughly, very briefly, Plato created a vision of the world as consisting of separate substances, matter and mind. And then how did this vision take hold? Well, it was adopted and spread far and wide by Christianity. And for this reason, it feels so familiar, and we don't recognize how astonishing it really is. I mean, we just fell for this mind, matter, body, soul thing, hook, line, and sinker. And the world has been fundamentally shaped by it. So for Nietzsche, our explanations of will swing between the extremes of this oversimple kind of dualism. Some of us take mind as the primary creative force, and we work out kind of intricate stories which involve this perfect Übermind as the origin and creator of all things. All is materialized at the will of this Übermind. And we place ourselves, obviously, in a special position because we are able to participate to some extent in mind. And we think of humans as essentially some kind of inner conscious self or central executive that freely decides what to do and plans and micromanages all of our actions. And we believe we completely cause our own decisions. They're not necessitated by prior causes like genetics or environment. Others completely disagree with all of that, swinging to the opposite side of the mind-matter dualism. They see the world as mechanistic, made up of aggregates and mechanisms, and there's only bottom-up causality. Behavior of the parts determines the behavior of the whole. So here we construct a deterministic universe where there is no space for will to play any kind of causal role. And we insist that our behavior is determined automatically, and the conscious self is epiphenomenal. Our conscious choices are powerless to make a causal difference to what will happen. Nietzsche argued that the creation of a mind-matter dualism that allows us to think of individual cells as fundamentally separate from the material world gives rise to this never-ending debate between free and unfree will. And it's not resolvable because both views arise from a created philosophical vision that doesn't do justice to reality. So he argued right back then that breaking free from the dualistic mindset needed the creation of a new philosophical vision. And he proposed something strikingly like the contemporary complexity paradigm, which recognizes humans as integrated with the world and constituted by these multiple levels of decentralized, self-organizing, distributed, dynamical systems, which integrate the physical and the cognitive. And so complexity accounts would see diverse causal players emerging at each level, from the subatomic to human societies. So there is downward causation, where the whole influences the parts through selection or constraint. And there's also bottom-up causation, where the parts impact the whole. So Murphy and Brown, in their book, Did My Neurons Make Me Do It?, argued that this kind of interconnectedness would just be common sense if philosophers and theologians hadn't persuaded us otherwise. So again, we might not completely share Halliday's confidence in our power of control, and there might be debates about the effectiveness of kind of individual versus collective action in addressing environmental issues. But it does seem clear that as both individuals and collectives, we do have some ability to act and some freedom of action, and we can take far more pervasive, energetic, and global action than we are currently taking. We know this intuitively, and I think we have the philosophical wherewithal with complex systems theory to argue for it. And we've had it, at least, I think, since Nietzsche. So why does the free will determinism debate persist? Nietzsche suggested that we have actually vested interests in maintaining our ambivalence regarding free will and determinism. And this might play into the reasons why we don't act in terms of the environmental crisis. So the myth of free will is kind of useful if you want to deflect blame from the societal order, that the kind of the interconnected we onto individuals. So we can just hold individuals entirely responsible for environmental and social problems. On the other hand, as an individual, I do want to claim agency and freedom to do as I choose, when it suits me. But if this freedom becomes too difficult and inconvenient, then I can shift the blame onto overwhelming circumstances, using kind of free will skepticism as an excuse for kind of giving up on my freedom. So I'm just scratching the surface here, but I think we can safely say that we have at least some agency to change the way we think, with everything that entails. Question is, do we actually want that change in philosophical vision, or do we want it enough? So just quickly turning to the other side of the will, to desire. I mean, if you think about it, of course we want a world to be a better place. Of course we want a safe and lovely environment and all those big things. Of course we want it. But one way to explain our unwillingness to change the philosophy and the behavior that defeats this desire is to see it as a problem of willpower. Contemporary manifestation maybe of Aristotle's acrasia, or weakness of will. So Aristotle acknowledged in opposition to Plato that humans could act against their own better judgment. We can fail to do what we genuinely believe to be right. And one of the manifestations of this would be to pander to current short-term wants that contradict our own long-term interests. I mean, that's something I would definitely want to explore further. I think there's something very important in that element of will that one should explore, and also the question of what humans really do desire. Do we even have long-term interests? So one quick other thing, maybe in the end, also related to will, the seminar's whole problematic is just a product of the will to power. So, all right, the will to power in an absolute nutshell. I see the way a thing is unfolding. The thing could be big, it could be the world, it could be just myself. with its beauties and its uglies. But I see the uglies as flaws, and I take it upon myself to try to fix the flaws and perfect the thing. Of course, this depends on a prior conception of what the thing should be like, which I have created to suit my own sensibilities. But whatever conception I have of a thing will always be ideological, always. And any desire to fix the thing according to my specifications reflects an overestimation of my own capacity and responsibility. In short, my will to power manifests at first the creation of an ideal according to which the actual thing is measured as wanting, and second, the creation of myself as its remedial agent. So Nietzsche met this kind of human hubris with a hoot of laughter and the injunction to embrace the uglies along with the beauties. So the question is, where does that leave us in face of what we are calling an environmental crisis? And that's where I'm going to end. I'm afraid, I hope that I've given you more questions and problems, and I haven't been able to answer anything. But yeah, thank you for listening. I'm going to stop sharing now and hopefully open up to responses. Okay, hi. Aragon, I see your hand is raised. Maybe we can start there.
Yeah, I mean, just
Hi.
thank you, first of all. It was really fascinating. And I love the way you covered the 8 principles of the dogmatic image so succinctly. It was very, very useful.
Thank you.
I was thinking in terms of that and how, one place where I think that chapter and Deleuze sort of don't go, well, particularly that chapter doesn't go far enough, is looking at the sort of structural constraints that define our thought, right? So, Deleuze is all like, oh, well, we think in these sort of like trite and sort of conformed ways through the dogmatic image and everything. But he doesn't grapple with the fact that sort of structures of, this is a very Foucauldian point, structures of knowledge and power are arranged in such a way that other forms of thought become exceedingly difficult, right? So when we think about these sort of things in the context of ecological crisis, it's like, well, we all know that the behavior many of us are complicit in is not contributing positively to solving the ecological crisis. Most of us eat meat, for instance, which is, is a catastrophic thing to be doing right now. But when we try to figure out ways to arrange our individual lives differently, it starts to seem incredibly difficult because the structures around us are predisposed to reinforcing the current way of life, right? So the question seems to be to challenge dogmatic image also entails contrasting different forms of arranging knowledge and power, which is a kind of prefigurative project, right? How do we arrange, instead of only describing the world, how do we start changing it? So that entails kind of collectively prefiguring other structures, right? So I wonder what your thoughts were on that. How do we start arranging those sort of more collective spaces of moving beyond the dogmatic image, not just as individuals, but as a society?
I think my response to that actually would be not Deleuzian so much as Derridian, because I don't think we can move beyond the dogmatic image of thought. I think that we need both the structures and forms and what the value that is given to us by the mode of processing that is the dogmatic image of thought, but it cannot become dominant. And I think that's that's how I would see Deleuze's problem, is that the dogmatic image of thought has become too dominant and needs to be interrupted and disrupted. I mean, the world works like that. Hey, as a complex system, you always have structuring and categorizing and measuring and forming, and then you have the movement of upsetting and disrupting. And so I mean, I like the distinction between processing and thinking. But I do think that Deleuze tends to want to move away from processing altogether and only have thinking, which would be chaotic. It would be a disaster. But the thing is that I think that we've lost the thinking, and that we need to, in the context in which we are now, we need to elevate and push and open more spaces for thinking rather than processing. But you can't go beyond processing. I mean, you just wouldn't have. I mean, you wouldn't be able to do anything practical. So I think that those structures that you're talking about are there because they work. They work for us in some way or another. That's what I think is also with, I know I'm gabbling a bit now, but with when Nietzsche talks about the that distinction between free will and determinism, it's not a logical it's not a viable, it's not a realistic, put it this way, distinction. It's an ideology that we have put up there, and it stays, even though we know that it makes no sense. And that is because it's useful in some way or another. And I think the same thing happens a lot with the kind of the forms of the dogmatic image of thought, that it's pretty darn useful for the most part to be thinking in that way. I would challenge anybody to see how their thinking works, and challenge anybody to be able to go beyond the dogmatic image of thought. So yes, I think that those structures have to be there, and I'm not sure how you find ways to mess with them without destroying the value that they give you. It's always going to be a vacillation between those two necessities. That's where the Derrida comes in. Okay, I hope that answered you a bit. I see Roger has his hand up. So Roger.
Yes, hello, Andrea and everyone. Yeah, thanks for that. Super interesting. I wanted to connect to a bit of what you were just saying, and to talk a bit about what came to mind to me as you were talking about the dogmatic image of thought and then its critique, was actually Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework. And his starting point with that is looking at different kinds of systems. And what stood out to me is that all of those pieces in the dogmatic image of thought are entirely appropriate for when we're sort of in this clear domain, where there's a very clear relationship between linear cause and effect. We want there to be best practice. There are bodies of knowledge that we can draw on. These things are easy to scale. There's a high degree of predictability. And all of that is quite wonderful and very appropriate in those contexts. And then to compare to the critiques of all of those, and what stood out to me is that's all around complexity in contexts where there's a nonlinear relationship between cause and effect, or even chaos. There's randomness here. And when we take methods that are appropriate to one domain and mismatch them somewhere else, then we're in for a lot of trouble. And I think one way of understanding what you're saying is that with so much emphasis being on a certain way of thinking, but the world is complex and interconnected, and we have these crises, how do we actually step out of that? I mean, how if we're entrained in a certain way of thinking and our certain methods, and now the world demands a different way, or invites a different way of being, which is around uncertainty and not knowing, and being able to flow into learning that's not predefined. How do we have courage to make that shift? And is that solely a thinking thing, or is that also a movement embodiment thing in there too? I wonder.
There's definitely an embodiment thing there. And I think as I was shifting towards the end, a component of will. Can we will that transformation? Can we will that shift? Or is it just going to happen to us? Is it forced by circumstances? Or is it something we can actually change on purpose. And the question would be, well, yeah, I don't know, do we want it enough? But going back to your other point, which I think is really important, what struck me is a wonderful analogy in a book called Embracing Complexity. Jean Bolton, I can't remember all the all the authors, but it has an analogy of a forest, and it's the analogy of a complex system and its growth and dynamism and decay, and there are different stages in that. And that, I mean, what you're saying there is exactly right, that at that point at which the forest begins, there's an enormous open amount of possibilities, and it's almost chaos. And then it starts to, the relationships start to form, regulation starts happening, self-regulation starts happening. I can't remember all of the stages, but you get to a point where the system is now much more stable, the relationships are forming, niche areas are forming, and things are very amenable to thinking in terms of the kind of stable structural thinking that you can see in the dogmatic image of thought. The danger with that is what they call lock-in, where those relationships become so specialized, the thinking becomes so kind of organized and functional and efficient that it becomes more and more stable, more and more static. And at some point, because it's locked in like that, because everything is so specialized, any kind of external disaster or threat to the system will collapse it. So it loses its robustness. And I think that it's a wonderful way of understanding that kind of relationship between the ideas and the preferences related to the dogmatic image of thought, and then those different way of being that is listed in a way by Deleuze in his critique. And I suppose our question would be, are we now at the point of lock-in? I think so. I think that the dogmatic image of thought has got us to the point of lock-in. We're too habituated, we're too static, we're too stable, and we are not going to be flexible enough, or we aren't flexible enough at this stage to weather the crises that we have created. So I don't know if that helps, but I mean, certainly that idea of a complex system working in a dynamic way, where there are different stages, where different ways of thinking are appropriate, makes a lot of sense to me. But yeah, I think because we're locked in now, I think we need that flame in a way, the flamethrower that is Deleuze and Nietzsche and all of those, to kind of, yeah, hurt us, wake us up, maybe. Okay, I can see other hands, and I'm not sure about the, yeah, just stick your hands up for the moment. I'll go to the comments in a bit. So, okay, I'm Alex, I see you. I'm probably not doing the right order, but I can't see what they are. Okay, so Alex. Alex.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Helen and Ragnar were before me in the queue. And I think I just
sorry.
That's
All
fine.
right.
My name's A, so I think that's why I was first.
Why it's up there first, yeah, okay. So let's do that then. Let's be sort of protocol right and chat to Helen first, and then Ragnar, and then Alex.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, hi Helen.
Good. Thanks so much, Andrea, for this whole series. Two things, if I can get my head around saying them. One of them is the time orientation. That if will is always future, And if learning is unpredictable beyond knowable, somehow those two things are a problem together. And one route to a fix would be an amor fati, where you will for what is happening to be happening. And that also gets away from the separation of an object of thought and a kind of dualism between the thinking subject and the object that is thought of, in which could be sort of sidelined if you think about an epistemology of caring, of knowing with a Goethean kind of knowing, where there isn't that separation. And if we don't have a time separation, and if we don't have a subject-object separation, if we're right in the thick of it, then the disaster that needs to happen can happen, and the disaster will be us changing beyond ways that we can possibly imagine. The world that we're trying to get to is a world we can't imagine, and we will be unimaginable to ourselves. How can you possibly will that except by embracing, let's go, right now, do the right thing? I don't know. I have more to say, but that's enough for now.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. I think that's it's exactly right in a way that is the problem of will, isn't it? That how could you will for something that you have no conception of, and so yeah, I think amor fati is exactly, that's where Nietzsche is leading us to, in the kind of the best you can do is overcome the will to power. So that was the final question in a way that I would like to pose, is if that is the case, then in a way the premise of the seminar is also questionable, because we're trying to look at the past and say, what were we thinking? How are we going to fix it in order to bring in a better, inverters, commas, future, which is something that is created by us, a thought about how the future should be. So in a way where we're kind of also engaging in a kind of activity which is governed by the will to power, and maybe we need to turn away from that, but then yes, that yeah, it's very difficult to kind of wrap your mind around that thought that potentially there isn't an environmental crisis or disaster. This is the way it is. We're in the thick of it. We need to love the uglies together with the beauties. Yeah. Yeah, try that one on. Yeah, I know. That is mind-blowing. So it's an uncomfortable, a very uncomfortable kind of thought to start grappling with. But yes, thank you. I think you're absolutely right. Okay, Ragnar.
Hi there, thanks.
Hi.
So I was glad to hear you say that the dogmatic image is partly necessary, that we need this sort of structure or what you call process in conjunction with thought. And that sounds spot on. I just wondering though if the sort of post-structuralist, postmodern approach a la Derrida and Deleuze is the best way to get there, though, because they constantly emphasize the radical creative part, and they struggle to find that foundation that comes from structure or stability. So, I mean, I'm just sort of wondering how you get from that sort of almost radical postmodernist view to this kind of dual this dual process, it sounds more like a kind of critical realism or even Husserlian dialectic or Kantian epistemology might be a better way to get that kind of balance between creativity and stability, or between the dogmatic image and the Deleuzian image, rather than focusing on Derrida and Deleuze, where you're going to constantly be misunderstood as emphasizing radical disruption and chaos and so on.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's one of the reasons why I sometimes hesitate to use or to say Derrida when I'm saying a certain kind of thinking, because of the fact that the name of this person just generates an allergic reaction. And so it's quite difficult. But if you actually look at what Derrida is actually saying, it's exactly this. It's so the very, very basic, repeatable kind of structure of the way that he thinks is that there is an economic way of structuring and looking at and interpreting the world. It's always there. And that economic way of looking at the world would be very close to what Deleuze has unpacked in relation to the dogmatic image of thought. And Derrida would say, give economy its chance. It has to happen. You cannot get beyond it. You can't move beyond that. But you can see the ambivalence in the word give economy its chance. It's basically give a chance for economy to do its thing. It's important, it's necessary. But on the other hand, there is always this aneconomic way of looking at things. And this aneconomic way of looking at things is chancey. You know, it says make chance happen to that economy. And that would be what Deleuze is kind of unpacking under the term thinking as opposed to processing. So for Derrida, you've got economic processing and you've got aneconomic thinking. And the two are both equally essential for understanding and grappling with a complex world. They contradict one another, they break apart from one another, they undermine one another, and you cannot choose between them. He'll say that 50,000 times in every text. There is not a matter of making a choice. You cannot choose between them. All you can do is negotiate them. All you can do is realize that the minute that you focus in a way that is too dominant on the economic, so on the dogmatic image of thought, you're going to experience, I think, that lock-in, that kind of rigidity that comes, the inflexibility, which will be your downfall. If you go too far to the other side and you keep on disrupting, then you are going to create a disaster that will also be your downfall. They are aporetic. He calls them aporias. Both of those things, both of those ways of being lead into dead ends. So what you have to do is consider the dead end of the relationship between them, which is that you cannot choose between them. And they're constantly working against one another, and you will go too far on one side, you'll mess up, you will react, you'll go too far on the other side, you'll mess up, you'll react, you'll go too far on the other side again. And that's the thing. That is our condition of being. You cannot get beyond one or the other. That would be his way of, I mean, I like that. I think that that's a very sensible way of thinking about a dynamic, complex reality, that there is just never going to be a point where one of those ways of thinking will realistically prevail. Sometimes one will be more dominant, and then you might have to, in that context, promote the other side. And I think that's what Deleuze and Derrida did in their lifetimes, particularly Derrida in the beginning of his kind of thinking. It was very much a matter of promoting this kind of disruptive thinking in a context where the dogmatic image of thought was just too strong. And I think that that's really where we are at the moment still, I think, because if you, as I said, if you Google what is thinking, you will get the dogmatic image of thought, and that's it. Try it. And so there is, I think, a need to open up the more disruptive way of being still today. Even though we have certainly, I mean, we are a bit more flexible, and a lot of us, I think, from both sides of the more kind of what would you call it, the more disruptive thinkers have become quite a bit more conservative, and the more conservative thinkers have become quite a bit more disruptive. So that kind of necessity of thinking the two together has become part of our new discourse, and I think it's important. I mean, it's part of a complexity discourse. I hope that answers you. I feel like I've maybe spent a little bit too much time there. So Alex.
Thanks, Andrea. This has been such an enjoyable series, and I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm definitely going to revisit it on YouTube. So I just have two comments, which are just more invitations for thought, really. What you've had to say in your presentation is substantial. I'm not so familiar with Deleuze, but I'm more familiar with Derrida. And so the first comment has to do with courage. So Aristotle, I think, I'm actually quoting what Alfonso Lingus said about Aristotle, but Lingus said that courage was the first virtue, not on a list of other virtues, but because without courage, there's no truth and there's no wit, there's no friendship and there's no love. And I'm wondering about whether the lack of resolve is part of the problem or there's just a lot of fear. And I find with some conservative thinkers, the fear around change or the unfamiliar or difference or the other tends to close down thinking because it's just inspired by fear. So if you could comment on courage, that'd be wonderful. And the second comment is there's a really wonderful documentary on Derrida that I was given. And in the documentary, someone asked him a question, who would be, which philosopher would be your mother? And then his charming reply is, I don't think any philosopher could be a mother because I always think of philosophy as something masculine. And he goes on later to say his work, because he distinguishes philosophy and thinking, is to try and give birth to a thinking mother. And I'm just wondering if you know what he means by that.
No. Okay, so I mean, we are sort of running out of time, but courage, I don't know if I've got anything kind of, just a thumb suck off top of my head to say, except that yes. I think that's it's an incredibly important concept, and I think we need a seminar on it. And I'm yeah, just making putting it out there. Yeah, courage and thinking, I think, and it's exactly that thinking in the way that Deleuze puts it definitely gets shut down because of fear. And maybe a lot of our reluctance to even face the thought of an environmental kind of disaster has to do with fear. Maybe we need to be talking, and not talking necessarily, but teaching courage at primary school. Yeah, rather than processing. So yes, I'm with you absolutely there. And yes, I very much do. I like the idea of philosophy being masculine, a certain kind of philosophizing, maybe the dogmatic image of thought. I mean, that's very stereotypical though, isn't it? I mean, one would like to think of thinking as kind of the feminine sort of energy that's getting itself in there. And I think that Derrida does look at it a little bit from when Nietzsche says, well, what if truth were a woman? What then? And then thinking would have to start happening. So yeah, but it's a very sort of stereotypical understanding of what men do and what women do. So yeah, I don't know. I like it, but I'm not sure. And what I do like about your comments, though, is that, as Deleuze says, problems attract other problems. So I think that we can have actually now, yeah, some incredibly interesting further seminars if anyone out there is interested. I'm going to pin the courage one on you, but the idea of feminine thinking or female thinking, feminine energy, if there is such a thing, that would be something I would also like to explore as a problem. Yeah, okay, so thank you. Not those are quite hedgy kind of answers, but just yeah, there's more stuff to be thinking about. Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, we kind of are out of time, and I see that there's quite a few essays on the chat, but I'm going to ignore you, I'm afraid. Apologies for ignoring text and preferring voice. I know Derrida would also have a bit of a laugh about that. What I will do though is when we do the YouTube thing, unless there's some really weird things in the chat, then I take the chat and copy it in as comments below the YouTube video. So if you have any burning questions, you can continue the conversation there. And hopefully we will keep on continuing this conversation for the rest of the year. There are some open slots in the seminar towards the end of the year. So if anybody is eager to present, then we, especially on the feminism thing, but also on other problems that are coming up, then I would very much like to hear from you. My email is andrea.hurst@mandela.ac.za. I'm sure you'll be able to find it on the invitation anyway to the seminar. So please just drop me an email if you're interested in presenting. And next week, we will be shifting to a much more practical problem, and that has to do with the kinds of thinking that encourages us. I don't know if that's exactly the right word. I also struggle with these words, but the kind of thinking that motivated us to put a highway across our city center between us and the ocean. What were we thinking there, and how is that related in a way to environmental issues? I'm not sure yet. It's something that we'll, get to figure out next week. Okay, so thank you all very much for listening. And yes, hopefully see you all next week. Okay, bye.